Hello and welcome to the Virginia Veteran and Family Support Program's Military Cultural Competency and Transition Awareness presentation. This is about 2 hours of your time, which we hope will be well invested and improve your understanding of some of the veteran experiences and how they and their families process some of the things they go through or may go through while serving in the military. My name is Ben Shaw. I'm the Central Regional Director for Virginia Veteran and Family Support Program. Also in this presentation, we're joined by Michelle Johnson, the East Regional Director, and she and I will be tag teaming this presentation throughout and hopefully give you some good information and keep you riveted in what may otherwise be a very boring format. So here goes. So we're going to read the first few slides here just to discuss what we're doing and why we intend to achieve in this. So here goes. This training provides an overview of military culture to include organizational structure, rank, branches of service, core values, and demographics, as well as similarities and differences between the active and reserve components, National Guard, and military family awareness. It also provides awareness of transition and reintegration needs for veterans and members of the National Guard and Armed Forces Reserves and their families. Next slide, please. And why are we doing this? Well, why is this important? So when we do this presentation live, one of the things we do is we pull up a poll and we ask folks, how many of you have served in the military? How many have immediate loved ones who served in the military? And how many of you have professionally worked with or somehow interacted with a veteran or service member in the past 90 days? For the most part, the answers reveal that a lot of folks in Virginia, although only roughly 10% of the population have served in the military, overwhelming majority of them have interacted with a veteran in the past 90 days or themselves are immediately related to or have a loved one who served in the U.S. military. So in Virginia, at least, this is something that you're going to encounter veterans, you're going to encounter family members of veterans. And our hope, of course, is that this has professional application as well as personal application. Next slide. And here are our objectives. Describe the military organizational structure, rank, branches of service, core values, and demographics. Identify key differences between the active and reserve components in National Guard. Identify characteristics of military transitions from active duty, deployment, and reintegration to civilian life and the challenges that arise. Identify best practices to enhance behavioral health, treatment options, and resources for military service members, veteran, family, and caregivers. And finally, discuss the prevalence and characteristics of suicide amongst military service members and veterans. Next slide. Why is this important? Well, the former Joint Chief of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, once said, quote, "But I fear they do not know us. I fear they do not comprehend the full weight of the burden we carry or the price we pay when we return from battle. This is important because the people uninformed about what they are asking the military to endure is the people inevitably unable to fully grasp the scope of the responsibilities that our Constitution levies upon them. We must help them understand, our fellow citizens who so desperately want to help us." Next slide. All right, so we're going to get going, and I'm going to kill my video so I don't have to look at myself. Here goes. So we're going to talk first about the culture of the military as it relates to the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So right now in the general public, you have laws. You're allowed to do this. You're not allowed to steal from your neighbors, trespass, on people's property without permission. Just as there's a civilian code, military code, or legal code, the military has one as well. It contains all the things that you expect in the civilian code to include, don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, things like that. But it also includes things that are specific and innate to military service, which relate to, frankly, order and discipline. For example, disrespect towards a senior non-commissioned officer, abandoning your post, disobeying a lawful order. All these things specifically relate to the enforceability of military orders and ensuring that everything takes place in the military supports the mission, basically. Each service or each branch of the military has its own set of traditions and acronyms and terminology. While there's some that is global within the military, there are many more that are specific to, say, the Air Force or the Army or the Marines or the Navy. Regardless of the branch, there is an organized rank structure, and with that, a predictable hierarchy and trajectory to one's career. At X rank, you can expect to do that or hold that role or that rank for roughly a certain number of months or years. You can expect at some point thereafter to be promoted, provided you qualify. And with that, your expectations of your position, your leadership, supervisor responsibilities will open up or increase as well. Every branch has a job designation for every single person. The Army and the Marine Corps call them military occupational specialties. MOSs is how we typically call them. The Air Force uses the term Air Force Specialty Code. The Navy, of course, daring to be different, uses the enlisted classification. Throughout the military, you will find a strong work ethic, accountability, and personal responsibility. You can summarize this as a mission focus. A lot of folks in the military place the mission, the organization, and their unit and the task at hand first, really at the expense of almost everything else, to include their health, their well-being, sleep, family. The mission has to come first. And actually, that's one of the appeals of hiring veterans, is that mission-first approach can oftentimes continues well beyond the military into civilian work as well. One of the potential benefits and drawbacks about the military service is the stoicism that a lot of service members have. Basically, suck it up, drive on, deal with it, grit your teeth. So you'll have folks who really dig in deep and really prioritize the mission in their organization and their peers, their colleagues. Again, it's oftentimes at their own expense, because it's not really an environment that even today people feel terribly comfortable talking about feelings, talking about struggles. They sort of grit their teeth and get through it. The advantage, of course, is that they can focus on the mission, that they can be mission focused and overcome challenges, and they're flexible when things start coming, because that happens throughout the military. However, the disadvantage is that if they need to process through things or debrief or just verbally process through, it can be challenging to do so. Next slide, please. This is just a brief chart that describes the diversity, and may be difficult to read because of the size. You will be getting a copy of this and every other slide in this slide deck, so don't worry too much if you miss some of the details. But it may be safe to say that the United States military is a cross-section of the general public. It really includes representatives from all races, creeds, backgrounds, and ethics. There is some, I guess, racial or ethnic changes when you get towards the higher ranks in the military, but broadly, on the ground, so to speak, it's everybody. It's a cross-section of the public. So a lot of military terms are not repeatable in the general public, but some of them are. I think one more and you'll have it right there. Some of the most common terms here is squared away. That means that my uniform is ship-shape. I am within regs or within regulations. My uniform has no wrinkles. The creases are where they're supposed to be. My boots are polished or bloused like they're supposed to be. My hat, my cap, my cover is worn as it should be. I am professionally, as I should appear, appropriately attired. In country is a term for being deployed. Just because someone's in country doesn't mean they are in active combat or in war. Not every day on a deployment is like storming the beaches of D-Day. In country can mean you're simply deployed to an area where your family is not allowed to follow you. Germany, your family can follow you and be stationed over there with you. That is not the case for Korea, Kuwait, Iraq, Afghanistan, places in Africa, and other parts throughout the world, Syria. In country can mean simply deployed to the forward edges of operations, and oftentimes and typically somehow in austere environment. Contingency is a term that relates to readiness. The military, at a moment's notice, always has a certain number of units ready to go. Bags are packed, sitting on their floors in the rooms, ready to just grab them and walk out the door and get on a flight. In fact, we saw that recently in Afghanistan. A number of Army and Marine units were rapidly recalled and deployed to Kabul, Afghanistan, to support the evacuation operations there. Contingency relates to just being ready to go, always having kind of one foot out the door. And the military has units that rotate through that contingency or that readiness posture. Next slide, please. So military terminology is not just we like to be weird and different. It has a purpose. Fundamentally, you have to communicate an enormous amount of information in a very short period of time in a way that's understandable, that cannot be confused or messed up. One of the most important things, if I'm calling for artillery or air support over my position, the last thing you want to do is have something lost in translation and somebody drops a bomb on me. The purpose of military terminology is to convey a lot of information very swiftly without degradation in quality. There's a lot of unique terms that you'll never find in the civilian world. Some of them are not repeatable. Frankly, to this day, I have terms that I learned for, say, cleaning equipment, certain types of devices used for cleaning machine guns in the military. I cannot repeat those outside the military environment because they're inappropriate, but I also don't actually have any of the name for these devices. So a lot of stuff in the military is very unique to that branch, that unit, and that job, and you'll never find it elsewhere. One of the advantages of this is you have the military kind of becomes its own little world, its own little culture or universe. A disadvantage, of course, is that when someone tries to convey a lot of their experiences to a civilian who hasn't necessarily had similar experiences, something may get lost. So it's important to ask questions if one does not understand. Next slide, please. These are some crosswalks for terms You might hear in combat means simply hazardous conditions, and that refers to what I said earlier about a hazardous area of operations where one's family cannot be stationed alongside the service member. You have companies, squads, and platoons. Those are units of varying sizes to which one is assigned. Squad is small, it's about 13 people. Platoon can vary significantly, as can a company. A medal is an award. Award is, say, be a good conduct medal. 3 years in the military without any sort of adverse action against your record. Awards can include a Bronze Star, Medal of Honor, Purple Heart. These are all medals or awards. The term is used somewhat synonymously. Military Personnel Office, that's the military's human resources. Everyone needs HR. A mission is a task or objective that comes down from higher. That is the leadership of the unit to which you are assigned. Another term you might hear is an op order, operations order, or a frag-O. Frag-O stands for fragmented operations order or fragmented order. And that is basically a very small amount of information that says, someone just tried to fire on our base from, here are the grid coordinates, go. And people will be sent outside the wire, sent on patrols, sent on missions with a very small, a fragment of information, and they have to act on it and figure it out as they go. And they may get rolling information as they arrive on target, but they may just have to go with very little. Reconnaissance, also frequently shortened to recon. That's out there looking around, collecting information, surveillance of some sort. And then regulations, that is, again, the military regulations. There's not only the Uniform Code of Military Justice, as we discussed earlier, but there's also regulations for virtually anything and everything that takes place during the military. How you salute, how you greet non-commissioned officers, how you greet commissioned officers, how you convey messages, how you change over your post to a new person. All this is contained within regulation. How you perform maintenance on a Humvee. All of this is contained within policies or guidelines in every single branch of the military. So being within regs is very important, and you're supposed to understand and know the regs for your job. Next slide, please. All right, every branch of the military has core values. You'll notice there is a significant overlap, 100% in fact, between the Navy and the Marine Corps, because even though the Marines dislike admitting it, they are a department of the Navy. So for the Navy and Marines both, the core values are honor, courage, and commitment. And to be very clear, these are not just mottos that sit on a wall somewhere intending to just sort of gather dust. People are expected to espouse these and live them and abide by them. And they are actually punishable to some degree under the Uniform Code of Military Justice if you deviate from the principles contained herein. Air Force uses integrity first, service before self, and excellence in all we do. Coast Guard, USCG, honor, respect, and devotion to duty. And then the Army, loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, and personal courage. Next slide, please. So despite those terms are different, by the way, you can see there's an enormous amount of overlap in the spirit of the creeds or mottos. The military ethos reflects or relates to how folks in the military view themselves, not just what they do and who they are, but also what they do in relationship to the world around them, in relation to civilians, to the country, the United States, military leadership and civilian leadership. The military ethos is very much a whole body thing. The military can be very much other focused. That is, we focus on the people around us, we focus on our unit, we focus on the mission, and it can be at times rather disparaging towards civilians. I know in the Marine Corps, at least in boot camp, they taught us to very much see civilians as nasty, dirty, slovenly, and we were supposed to be the elite war fighters of the world, and to sort of view ourselves as very much different from. So it doesn't necessarily promote togetherness with the general public, but actually it serves a purpose for cohesion within the unit, within the military itself. It is intended to ensure that we're all on the same page, we all have the same mission, the same vision and focus, which is essential to carry out and complete any sort of mission, especially one where you're under fire. Next slide, please. Every branch of the military has a creed of ethics. Again, just like the mottos or the core values, these are meant to be taken seriously and they reflect or tell you something about the military branch. For example, the Army has the Soldiers Creed, which talks about honor and serving, devotion to duty and country, and Army this and Army that. I'm being somewhat insulting to see the point. And that obviously tells you a lot about how the Army wishes its soldiers to view themselves and view the Army and view the world. Likewise, the Marines have the Rifleman's Creed, which interestingly says very little about the Marine Corps and a whole lot about this is my rifle. There are many like it, but this one is mine. It basically focuses on I love my gun, and my job is to use my gun to execute the needs of the United States, the President, and the United States Marine Corps. Next slide, please. So, an important thing to know that everyone who serves in the military has a designated rank. Pay grades E1 through E9 are enlisted ranks. I will tell you the overwhelming majority of people who serve in the military do between 4 and 6 years, and then they get out, they discharge honorably. That's about 70%, I believe. That's a ballpark figure. Do one, quote, stint or contract of service in the military. And oftentimes people come in as E1, E2, or maybe in some rare cases, E3 and E4. So they start at the lower junior grade enlisted ranks, and over time and based on performance and also the needs of the military, they are promoted to higher ranks. Non-commissioned officers are those who've achieved some time in the military and with that are awarded additional responsibility and accountability. Depending on the branch, it can be E4, E5, and the Navy views it some a little bit higher than that. The non-commissioned officer is like every other branch of the military. They're expected to have a significant amount of responsibility and accountability and leadership opportunities oftentimes at a very young age. You could have a 19-year-old with an entire squad in his or her charge, or a 21, 22-year-old with something similar. The military expects leadership of virtually every single person of all ranks, but certainly imposes it onto the lower ranks of the non-commissioned officer corps very early on. Warrant officers, they are oftentimes considered unicorns. They're specialists. There's not too many of them, depending on the branch of the military. They are supposed to be experts in some specific field. For example, some are experts in administrative processes. Others are experts in engineering practices, how to fix a certain kind of engine on a naval vessel, or nuclear operations, or in the Army uses them to fly helicopters a lot, or tactics and weapons deployment and training, nuclear, biological, chemical, radiation training, CBRN is the term. Warrant officers are experts and they're sort of universally respected. A lot of times they came from an enlisted background before receiving commissions. They receive a lot of respect and a lot of consultation from virtually every rank in the military. The officer corps, certainly in comparison to the enlisted ranks, the officers are the strategic planners, the long-range thinkers, and the executives, if you will, of every unit. They're fairly small in number. There's only a couple officers per unit, and they basically set the tone. This is the mission, and they turn it over to the enlisted group, who will then put together the plan in part and execute it. So the enlisted folks are the doers, if you will. The officers are the planners and strategic thinkers. There's certainly a lot of overlap in all of these, but fundamentally, the officer corps are the folks who have significantly more civilian and military education. A lot more time and money is invested in training them for their roles in the military, and then the enlisted ranks are expected to be able to carry out whatever orders they receive from the commissioned ranks. Next slide. These are some of the crosswalk terms, or based on rank, if you will, or even field of the military. So, for example, a commander of the military may crosswalk over to be a director or a senior manager, an executive officer of the military, deputy director, so on and so forth down the list. You'll note that on the left-hand column, you see the term infantry, and it crosswalks over to security force. Many of those who serve in the infantry find that there's not a whole lot outside in the civilian world for which they may be qualified, with the possible exception of something like law enforcement. Although, truth be told, the culture and expectations of law enforcement are still radically different from what's expected of a combat soldier or combat marine in the infantry. So even then, that's not a perfect crosswalk. First sergeants, those are these more senior enlisted in the ranks, may come across as personnel managers, squad leaders. They're going to be team leads and supervisors and so on and so forth. Please note that the overwhelming majority of people who serve in the military do not serve for an extended period of time. It's maybe 4 to 6 years, and they cycle out. So you do not have many executive officers or senior supervisors or operations leaders leaving the military and waltzing into civilian jobs. Oftentimes you had somebody who did 4 to 6 years in some specific or semi-specific job, which may or may not have application in the civilian world. Next slide. There are currently 6 branches of the military. I know a fair amount about 5 and a whole lot of nothing about the 6th, which is the Space Force. But starting with the Army and the Navy, the Air Force and the Marines and the Coast Guard, you'll see they have been around for an extraordinarily long time. Of those 5, the newest is the Air Force, which was split off from the Army after World War II. And then much more recently, than the past 2 years, Space Force was developed. Don't know much about them, so don't know the numbers or kind of what their role is exactly. We can make some inferences that they're going to pull away some of the duties of the Air Force. but that's a guess. You'll notice also that 5 of these branches have reserve components. So there's a lot of active duty people serving in all 6 branches. 5 of these have a smaller number, not much smaller, serve in reserve status part-time. And 2 of them have National Guard status, which is almost a militia type, similar part-time focus to the reserve, but actually answerable to different authorities when not activated to active duty service. Next slide. These are sort of off script, meaning what I'm going to say is not listed on the slides, but I think it might help explain the differences, say, between the Army and the Marines and the Navy and so forth. The Army is big and large and has an enormous amount of equipment and logistical support to take and hold territory. So Army, we can say, takes and holds territory. Next slide. Marine Corps, in contrast, is much smaller, moves more swiftly, moves more limberly. They have the ability to take territory, but not the ability, logistics, people, numbers, time, size to hold territory. So Army takes and holds, Marines take and move on, or to take, destroy, then move on. And of note, they are largely amphibious as their platform for operations, meaning they launch off of naval vessels. They have a lot of amphibious, semi-amphibious equipment, and also there's a lot of amphibious training too. Next slide. What's unique about the United States Navy is if you include the Marine Corps, the Navy is actually itself a miniature military. It has air, certainly has naval operations, and it also has ground elements in the form of the Marines. So the Navy is just a miniature military, but in this slide, for this purpose, it's largely nautical in nature. It has a lot of force projection expectations. Naval vessels are sailing throughout the world right now, with aircraft sitting on them, with Marines sitting inside them, with amphibious vehicles ready to jump out the back. Seriously. They are always out there in some form or fashion, and oftentimes become the platforms on which operations are staged into a theater. Next slide. The Air Force, remember, it's a spin-off from the Army Air Corps back right after World War II. They are the smart folks, in my terms. They're the ones who are technical experts in aircraft and satellite and radars and nuclear, missile systems, a lot of space stuff. And again, my assumption is that the space stuff will move up to Space Force in time. But fundamentally, the Air Force is the smart ones, the technical experts. They are not as likely to be numerous on the ground in theater of operations, which is not to say they're not there. They're, however, not there in the numbers that you find with the Army and the Marines. They're meant to be technical experts, and oftentimes, heck, I mean, you have a mountain somewhere in the United States where people are remote control operating drones throughout the entire world at any given time. All of this falls under the Air Force. Next slide. We have the Coast Guard. What's interesting about the Coast Guard is a lot of people who did a stint in the Army and the Marines or some other branch of the military find their way into the Coast Guard, and that's because the people find the mission very appealing. And they really get their hearts behind it, so to speak. So there's a lot of retreads, if you will, from other branches of service in the Coast Guard. They don't just, sail up and down the coast of the country, grabbing people who float out to sea in gigantic flamingo inner tubes. They actually have a lot of drug interdiction, law enforcement operations, intercept missions. I've been on vacation in Central America and seen Coast Guard operations down there. They are all over the place, and certainly they've been in Iraq and Afghanistan as well. But a lot of times their presence is off the coast of the United States, more of a law enforcement capacity. Note that they are under Department of Homeland Security as a baseline, but they're transferred under the Navy during times of war. Next slide, please. Space Force, don't know much about them, which is why this slide doesn't have terribly much. My biggest complaint is that they seem to have stolen the symbol from Star Trek for their logo. Next slide. Armed Forces Reserve. So we've talked about active duty. Those are the people who live, eat, breathe military. They live on base, they live in barracks, or they live right off base in base housing or in the immediate community around an active duty base. And their day-to-day job is to don a uniform and go support some mission on that base or overseas. The Armed Forces Reserve, in contrast, it's called part-time soldiery, if you will. Their expectation is to be in uniform, serving 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks a year. So they go to the armory, they work on operations, they train, they brush up on skills, and then for 2 weeks of the year, they perform some sort of field operations or larger, more extensive training operation The operations tempo of the last 20 years has been such that the 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks a year has oftentimes become a 3 or 4 day weekend a month, and maybe 3 weeks a year of training, or maybe 2 intervals of 2 weeks of training per year. So the expectation on the part-time soldier has increased over the past many years, and certainly the Armed Forces Reserve, like the National Guard, have been tossed into full-time active duty operations with the frequency up, or maybe a higher frequency than even active duty. Next slide. These are the numbers. So we have well over 1 million serving in active duty. You have 800,000 though in reserve. And again, 5 branches of the military are reflected under reserve components. Next slide. Individual ready reserve. So when I enlist for an 8-year contract in the Marines, I may only wear a uniform and train and deploy all over the place for 4 years. At the end of that, they'll hand me a DD-214, a discharge paperwork. I am obligated to make sure the military knows where I am and can get me for the next 4 years after that. So the military, by contract, reserves the right, if needed, to yank me back to active duty service if the situation demands. And that certainly has happened plenty of times over the past 20 years, where people, especially in technical fields, have gotten out of the military, and the military soon thereafter said, we need you back. And they are allowed to do that. They pull them back to service. You can imagine that morale is pretty low in those units. This is not to be confused with the term stop loss, where the military is allowed to actually not let you go by contract allowance. They can keep you as long as they need you based on the needs of the military. So yes, it's a 4-year contract after duty in uniform, but they got you for 4 more if they need you. Next slide. So the Army National Guard, there's an Air and Army component both to this. Every state, territory in the country, Washington, D.C., has National Guard. In Virginia, that's a little over 9,000 men and women who serve in the Air and Army National Guard. I think probably the best way to describe this is that whereas the reserve components are truly part-time active duty troops, the National Guard is part-time governor's militia. And the distinction to that is basically the governor of any state, territory can call to active duty, state duty, the militias, the National Guards, for all sorts of operations. This is weather-related stuff, the hurricanes, the snow, COVID-related operations, vaccine clinics, civil unrest in Virginia, Washington, D.C. as well. Those can all be activations per governor's order, and does not actually count towards that person's time as an active duty federal soldier or airman. So the distinction with National Guard is whether being activated to state service or federal service. Both have some pay associated, but the benefits towards being considered a veteran, being defined by VA, federal standards as a veteran, do not happen for that National Guard or air soldier unless they are activated to federal status. Next slide. These are the locations of armories throughout Virginia, the stars. You'll notice the ovals. Armories are not terribly large, so what happens is units are typically broken down by some other unit designation, and they're kind of blobbed together. So the Stanton and Charlottesville armories have some relationship based on the units. They all may be part of the 116th Infantry, for example. The Northern 81 Corridor, the Winchester, Woodstock, Harrisonburg, again, have some relationships. So these are kind of like sister units, if you will, to these National Guard armies, which are throughout the state. By the way, please don't assume that just because someone lives or enlisted for the National Guard in Charlottesville, that they're always going to be drilling at the Charlottesville Armory. Oftentimes, the only way to promote or move around or move up the ranks in the National Guard is to accept an assignment at some other National Guard unit. So really, the 1 week in a month, 2 weeks a year, everyone gets on the road and goes to their armory or their training location, which could be Fort Pickett, which is Central South Virginia. But in any event, people kind of get all on the road and go all over the place to get to the armory of their assignment, not just roll out of bed and go right down the road to the nearest armory. It doesn't work like that. Next slide, please. So this is the what I was referring to, National Guard activation for state versus federal service. So the state is the Title 32, and that's the governor's orders. Title 10 is the presidential, the federal activation to federal status. And again, it's only federal activation that starts allowing one to accumulate federal benefits, to include GI Bill, eligibility for VA and other potential opportunities. Title 10 versus Title 32. The truth is, someone may serve 30 years in the National Guard. If they were not activated to federal service at any point, the VA does not consider them a veteran. They have to have the federalized Title 10 orders. Next slide. So while all casualties are unfortunate, please note, thankfully, that the casualties for the past 20 years of conflict are considerably lower than they have been in the past. There's a lot of reasons for that. Advances in medicine, advances in vehicle armor, body armor. Suffice it to say, any casualty is unfortunate, obviously, but these thankfully are much better rates than we've had in previous conflicts. And you can see them. Next slide, please. I think what's most tragic about this slide is I think someone can sort of at some level understand or move through the grief of losing a loved one to a killed in action, hostile death. What is more difficult perhaps may be the non-hostile deaths, the accidents. You'll see the number who died from that are pretty high, and the wounded in action number is very high as well. What's interesting is I think a lot of service members have put some time, real time and energy into considering what it'd be like if they got blown up and never came home, or killed and never came home. I think a lot fewer of them have invested time into what it'd be like to come back with a significant and permanent injury. Next slide. So these are some of the characteristics of Operation Iraqi Freedom, Operation Enduring Freedom, and Operation Freedom Sentinel, I believe is OFS. Basically Iraq and Afghanistan over the past 20 years. First of all, there has been a heavy dependence on National Guard and Reserve. An example of that would be in 2005 in Iraq, a lot of the active duty units had already cycled through a deployment or two and were back in the United States training to go again. The largest ground elements in 2005 were Guard and Reserve in Iraq, not active duty. The Army for the longest time has relied on 18-month deployments, activations for its soldiers. So you can imagine, it's a year and a half away from your family, deployed overseas, and you may get a couple weeks here and there of R&R, maybe once during the entire deployment. But still, that is a significant departure from your family, your civilian job, your life, your friends, your community of support, while based with the military. It's been really challenging on relationships and families and marriages throughout this whole period. There has been at times high-intensity urban warfare, especially in places like Sadr City, Iraq, Baghdad, Ramadi, Fallujah, places in Afghanistan like Marja. But in other times, it's very rural in either country, and the rock shoot at you, or the palm tree shoots you, or the dirt shoots at you. It just depends. The environments have been very, very different depending on where one was serving. And you may be riding through the desert with nothing around, then suddenly find yourself in essentially an urban area. Regardless of the theater, whether it be Iraq or Afghanistan, there's been an enormous amount of use of IEDs, improvised explosive devices, and RPGs, which are rocket-propelled grenades. And that has been one of the chief areas where the United States has absorbed casualties, has been IEDs. You're driving along and a bomb goes off and it blows up your vehicle and everybody in it, or you're walking along on foot on a foot patrol and a bomb goes off and has a catastrophic effect on people nearby. IEDs, just so you know, are largely old artillery rounds which have been hidden, squirreled away, and then converted into an improvised bomb. They're detonated either with radioactive signals or just a wire. Every now and then they'll do something creative, or maybe they'll pack a car with it and drive a car into a military gate and try to blow it up at the door. Again, due to advances in body armor and vehicle armor both, as well as medicine, people have survived a lot more in the past now than what they did in the past. But it has created a bit of a challenge for the medical community, because you have people who survive catastrophic injuries and they have significant limitations. They could be triple or quad amputees. And the challenge is, how do you maximize that person's independence and quality of service, despite the fact they are very disabled and will be reliant in some form on a caregiver for the rest of their lives. Next slide. So I don't want to suggest that everyone who serves in the military is going to be a victim of that experience. For the past 50+ years, everyone who served is a volunteer. That's important. But you should know that there are some potential stressors that may be innate to military service if you serve for any length of time. Foremost, there are frequent moves. If you serve more than, say, 3 years, you can guarantee you're going to start having to buy and selling. You're going to have to buy and sell houses and move around, or get transferred from barracks to barracks and unit to unit. The military sort of has a programmed indigence expected of its belligerents, and you go all over the place wherever you need. I've had service members I've served with, or veterans I've served with, they talked about moving 17 times in 21 years or 18 times in 30 years. People can just expect to move around a lot. So you can guarantee your kids are not going through 12 grades of school with the same group of fast friends. You're constantly, the whole family is going to be uprooted and moved throughout that experience as well. So your community of support may be innately smaller at least the natural familial community of support, because you're always going somewhere else, changing schools, changing churches and organizations and clubs and neighbors. You're just always around. So that may have a consequence. You can't exactly, drop off the kids with grandma and go away for a date weekend with your spouse if grandma's on the other side of the country. So you lose kind of that family connection, you sort of lean back on them. You don't have that in the military. Certainly those over the past 20 years who've been serving and deployed a lot, there is obviously separation related to that, and that is taxing on both the service member for its own reasons and also those left back in the United States for their own reasons. The single parent often experiences a lot of role changes. They have to be they have to steady the ship, be nurturer and disciplinarian both, while spouse deployed is gone for some length of time. And despite the fact the military does pay people to move, there's always costs associated with that, hidden costs. For example, I had one friend actually, she said that every time they moved, they were never in one place long enough to finish the condiments in the refrigerator door. So every 18 months to 2 years, she'd throw away the ketchup, the mustard, and all the other stuff in the fridge door that never actually got used. You have to buy it when they started somewhere else. Similarly, people don't really keep their cleaning supplies in the cabinets. They either walk away from it or throw it away. No one packs Windex and a broom when they move. They just leave and walk away and buy the new stuff. So there's hidden costs associated with it. And of course, if the housing market is up or down, you may not make money on the house sale. You may lose money. Next slide. But everyone is affected by combat experiences. This is a screenshot from the movie Black Hawk Down. And while it's a movie, what they depict there is accurate. In the military, I don't know of a single unit that has gone out and come back X months later with the exact same people in the exact same condition. Some people go down, and unfortunately, some of them will not get back up. Next slide. But this can be a typical day on a deployment. This is a firefight in 2010 in Logar province of Shark District, Afghanistan. They are firing over the head of another unit that's pinned down, and they're firing into some buildings and trees where there are some Taliban fighters or Al-Qaeda fighters and shooting at them. This is a typical day if you're doing foot patrols in Afghanistan. Next slide. This is a typical day in both Iraq and Afghan theaters where you have an enormous vehicle in the background. That's a MRAP, a mine-resistant assault platform, I think is the term. It weighs about 26 tons, but clearly it is not completely immune to attack. So you have someone who's injured here. You have two people carrying them. This is a typical day during the height of the Iraq War when IEDs were a daily thing for a lot of operations and a lot of areas of operations. And it was actually a very common thing to happen in Afghanistan as well. In the areas you could even get a vehicle because the roads and terrain are so austere in many places, it's nothing but foot traffic or motorcycle traffic. Next slide. This is a unfortunately typical happening on a foot patrol. This is a Marine unit, and you can see up front an enormous IED has gone off on people on the ground. The kill radius for an artillery round that's usually used as an IED is 100 meters. So you can see that a lot of people are within range of that 100 meters. The damage or casualty radius for an IED or a 155 round is 300 meters. So almost everybody is within range of some potential injury based on that blast. And again, it doesn't have to be the shrapnel hits you, just the blast wave or debris alone can severely injure somebody. Unfortunately, a very typical day on foot patrol in Afghanistan. Next slide. But this is real life. Being stuck in traffic on 64 or 81 or 95 or anywhere north of Stafford County in Northern Virginia or down near the bridge in the Southeast. Screaming children, which at least in my case somehow activates the guilt hormone that I've done something wrong as a parent. Being stuck in classrooms with crowded people where you cannot control or even see your entire surroundings can be uncomfortable for someone who's been trying to do just that. Marriage is hard under all circumstances. You are two different people who have very different experiences. And of course, in the military, those experiences are oftentimes separated from each other. You can't just come back together and pick up where you left off. There's a constant restarting or re-engaging or redating associated with relationships that succeed. You have to be bomb-proof in order to survive that well. And then frankly, it doesn't matter whether you served in the military or not. Going to Walmart stinks. It can be very hard to be in an environment where you're surrounded by people you cannot effectively threat assess. You can't control your movements or theirs. You can't see the exits and you have no idea what's going on at any given time because everyone's fighting with each other or they're all just in your way. That's real life, unfortunately. Next slide. So this is the emotional cycle of deployment. Without going into details on what you see written, the best way to state this, as far as I can tell, is when a service member is told that he or she should be ready to deploy in X, Y, Z months or days or whatever, that is the point at which he or she begins to emotionally disengage from family in order to emotionally engage with the mission, the unit, one's colleagues, one's chain of command, one's subordinates, because those are the ones who are going to keep you alive and keep you safe. Suffice it to say, if I'm beginning to emotionally disengage with my family, having just announced that I'm deploying in X months, that is probably at the point at which they're trying to probably emotionally engage with me as much as they can to wring the last bit of relationship and time with me before I go. So you're basically moving in the opposite direction of your loved ones prior to deployment. While deployed, you're trying to keep your head in the game, but every time you call home to talk to your wife, your husband, your kids, they're pulling your head out of the game and heart out of the game. So in some degrees, it can make you a bit of a house divided and emotionally pull you away from what you need to be focused on, which is the mission, your troops, your command, and staying alive and staying safe and also completing the mission. Coming back home, the honeymoon phase is oftentimes short-lived. It usually lasts until the kids start screaming in the back of the minivan, and then it's a disaster. So suffice it to say, oftentimes the loved ones of a service member and the service member are moving frequently in different directions from each other, and that can create some conflict and challenges. Next slide. So these are some of the stressors of, potentially stressors of combat itself. There's a transition stress. The truth is, leaving your family is stressful. Coming back home to your family can be equally stressful. There's periods of readjustment associated with all of that. Combat stress, just because you have been in a combat zone and been exposed to combat and you come back and you're jumpy for 6 or 8 weeks after you get back, doesn't mean you have PTSD. It just means that you've been in an environment where people have been trying to kill you. And it's going to take some time for your body and your physiology to readjust. And that's considered totally normal. It's when those symptoms persist after a period of time or get worse, that's when it's considered perhaps diagnosably PTSD. There's the serious injuries piece. We've talked about the potentials for that and how that may not have been something people have processed through. And truth be told, I'm not sure how one would, but a lot of people are left with serious injuries and they have to figure that out. Roles change. You're a husband, you're a provider, for example, and now you rely on your spouse as a caregiver. Her role is therefore changed as well. So it changes the equanimity of relationships. It changes people's perspectives and visions of each other and themselves. And it creates potentially a lot of challenges, especially with brain injuries where there are potentially cognitive and personality impairments as well. In the Guard and Reserve issues, this is perhaps a controversial statement, but I oftentimes believe that those who serve the National Guard and the reserves oftentimes leave behind more than someone who serves in active duty. And that's because the military for them is a part-time role. So we can probably infer that they have families, they have full-time jobs, they have rents or mortgages, they have responsibilities in communities in which they were embedded, and all that goes poof away while they have to deploy to active duty. They go over, they do their thing. When they come back, the unit itself disbands, and they are supposed to go back to those other civilian responsibilities very abruptly. The job, the family, the whatever it is, the community support, the church, the club, the organization, all that sort of comes flying back at you very, very quickly. So this is obviously a generalization, but the Guard and Reserve, they experience a lot of changes and disruption to their civilian lives to activate to federal service. And then they also have a lot of disruption when they deactivate from federal service and go back to civilian life. Next slide. So this is a point where we typically would do another poll, just to sort of ask people's perspectives on this. But let's talk about suicide. True or false? Deployment is the leading cause of suicide in service members. Well, the truth is it's false. The studies of suicides that have taken place in uniform have revealed that an enormous number were related to relationships failing and also substance use, by the way. So please remember the veterans are human beings first, and they are subject to the same relationship troubles and stresses of that as anybody else. So no, deployment doesn't potentially increase one's risk of suicide. Relationships and problems with relationships can increase one's risk. And certainly the military does stress and strain relationships. We can agree to that. Statement number 2, the majority of service members who die by suicide had mental illness. False. Not true. The majority of service members who died by suicide did not at that time have any diagnosis of mental illness, period. It was not identified. It was idiopathic, if you will. Next statement, approximately 1/2 of service members who died by suicide received some form of care, not necessarily related to behavioral health or suicide, specifically within 90 days of their death. Yes, that is a touch point that is being attempted to be capitalized on right now. Service members will show up somewhere prior to the death, more often than not, in some sort of healthcare system. It could be counseling, therapy. It could be just going to a doctor's office. One of the reasons that veterans are asked about suicide every time they go to just a healthcare check at the VA is they're looking to capitalize on the potential touch point and ask how someone is doing and offer them assistance if they need it. So yes, true. Although it is not known whether these individuals were suicidal at time of contact, yes, over 50% of them do show up within healthcare systems 90 days prior to their deaths. So suicide rate is higher amongst combat veterans and non-combat veterans. False, not true. There are actually some insulating qualities to combat experience. Tell you what, the best way to form fast friends with a unit is to go through a firefight together. You'll be so impressed and relieved that you all lived and survived it. You will form oftentimes lifelong, real friendships with the people you serve with, and they can become a real insulating and support network for you, and also had similar experiences to you. There is no data right now to support that being in a combat environment increases your risk of suicide. Some studies, I think it was 2011, showed that of all those who died by suicide in 2011 in the Army, only about 55% had even deployed. And of that percentage that deployed, fully 85% of them had not been exposed to something that we would traditionally describe as or define as, quote, combat. Next slide. Transitioning. Okay, so transitioning home, whether you are actively in combat overseas or just simply departed from your family for a long period of time, typically though more for combat veterans, there is always a level of survival, or there may be a level of survivor skill. Veterans oftentimes, they've been trained to sort of view themselves as having an infinite sense of accountability while maintaining a youthful sense of invincibility. That is a quote from a book by Colonel David Grossman called On Killing. An infinite sense of accountability while preserving a youthful sense of invincibility. Oftentimes, what may be inferred from that is that veterans consider themselves to be in control of a lot more than they actually are. So people say things like, if I had just been on that deployment and not transferred, those folks wouldn't have died. If I had just zigged when I had zagged instead, those folks would be alive. If I had just done that, something bad wouldn't have happened. They oftentimes self-assign a level of responsibility or guilt for things that were really beyond their control, but it becomes very difficult for some to overcome and move through. The belief that I did something wrong or the decision I made resulted in the death of somebody else or the injury of somebody or some negative outcome. Moral injury is a concept that's growing in terms of a discussion point and a study point. The idea that a veteran may not view him or herself as the good guys or doing the right thing or the righteous warrior or the good cause. They may view themselves as the aggressor or the bad guy, or at very least no better than the other side. And that oftentimes relates to incidents that are not clear cut. For example, a vehicle checkpoint where a vehicle runs at the unit and they have to shoot it as a precautionary measure, shoot the people in the vehicle, and they thought maybe it was a car bomb, and they get up and they discover it was actually a family with kids. So the moral injury relates to essentially the bad shoots or the unavoidable collateral damage on a battlefield where the veteran does not, their conduct does not fit within their worldview as a service member, as being honorable, perhaps even also with their faith background and moral traditions. They view themselves as something other than the good guy. And that can be very difficult to contend with. And I may also note that the outcome of a conflict itself can relate to moral injury. Gosh, I thought we were the good guys, but the way we left Afghanistan conflicts with what I think the good guys would do. Things like that. Those have to be processed through. And of course, changing combat zone responses to things that are appropriate to the civilian world. The majority of things that keep you alive and alert and ready to go and combat ready in the combat zone do not make you a nice, warm, hospitable person as a civilian. The kind of most people see you as a jerk and a little bit high-strung. So taking those things that kept you alive and safe, the survival skills, and dialing them back or turning them off to be successful in communicating with civilians in the civilian world, civilian community, can be very challenging, especially if you've spent some number of years practicing being, in a combat zone, and these things kept you alive. So why would I want to turn off and abandon traits that kept me alive? That seems anathema. So learning where to sort of abandon those can be hard for some people. Next slide. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and turn this over to a video. And I believe my colleague, Michelle Johnson, is going to pick up from here. So let's go ahead and watch the video first. Here we go. All right, so I misspoke. I actually have a couple more slides before I turn it over to Michelle. So we're going to get that pulled back up here and pick up where we left off. All right, so next slide, please. So reintegrating into family life, either post-military or post-deployment. These are some of the challenges that have to be contended with. First is communication issues. Obviously, if I was a Marine sergeant or Marine NCO, it does not really do me any good to treat my family like a bunch of subordinates, but that is the type of leadership and supervision and communication that I've known. So obviously that has no place in a family. It really has no place in a lot of workforces as well. Civilian workforces, I have to learn how to communicate with people effectively. I also have to learn how to even bare my soul, which can be hard to do. The truth is, a lot of folks who deploy have seen some pretty awful things, either participated in or saw or witnessed or heard about. There's a lot of challenges, I guess, if you will. They're trying to find a way to communicate that to your loved one in the United States. So I may try to maybe form a closer bond with my spouse and share some of my military experiences, or start talking about firefights or certain the so-and-so who died or something like that. As it relates to my actions in the battlefield, it actually can do more harm than good, in that it may jeopardize that person's view of me as a fundamentally good, safe, gentle, upright, honorable person. Because battlefield life, battlefield experiences are very different from the needs of civilian experiences. So one of the problems here is, how much do I share to form a closer bond and really engage with my spouse or loved ones? And how much would be an overshare, which actually makes that relationship worse? I think some people might try to listen because they think it's the right thing to do, and then up hearing too much and regretting it. Other people perhaps put up a hand and say, I don't need to hear about that, because they're smart. But then the risk is, did I share enough? Did I share too much? So I think a lot of veterans just choose to share nothing at all. And then, of course, they get the accusation that they're closing people out and not letting people in. So almost everything you do is wrong. There's the overstimulation. If I've been in an environment where I have to focus simply on who's shooting at me and why, it's very hard to get into an environment where I can't control my surroundings. And that's the Walmart, the crowded lines, the busy crowds. You can't threat assess. You can't watch what people's hands are doing. You can't see who has a suspicious bulge in their belt or is wearing a vest that looks a little bit too large. All of that is impossible in most civilian environments. Even during COVID, it's very hard to control your surroundings. So it can leave one feeling very overstimulated. As far as intimate partner violence, I don't want to suggest that veterans at a higher risk for domestic violence. I actually don't have the data on that. But what I can certainly tell you is that a lot of veterans who are experiencing night terrors, like PTSD, or some of those things, will be thrashing in their sleep, talking, cursing in their sleep, speaking Arabic, swinging their arms around, flailing as they kind of relive a firefight or think about sort of worst case scenarios. And they may whack a spouse. I've had friends who actually, his wife woke him up one day, leaning over his head and said, "If you hit me one more time, I'm leaving you." And it motivated him to get some help, and he actually is doing much better for it. And I know the story not because he told me, but because his wife told me. Roles change when people deploy. If I deploy and my wife and my kids stay back home, she's going to probably discover a new level of independence, that she has to put the ladder onto the gutters every year and clean them out with leaves. She's going to learn how to start the mower and mow the grass, and take care of this, that, and the other household stuff, and things that may have traditionally fallen to, quote, the man of the house to do, or vice versa. If dad is left behind while wife deployed, mom deploys, dad has to discover things that wife did that he probably didn't realize were even being done. So people's roles change while the other person, or people plural, are out of that situation. And it'd be unrealistic to expect those to just pick where they left off when people come back together. So whoever picked up the additional roles may be reluctant to let them go. They may like them. So going back again to the communication issues, there may be a lack of sensitivity towards the partner. The highlight of my day may be that I got a paper cut into my hand and it really hurt. And I come home and tell my spouse who just came back from a combat zone, and they're thinking, well, that's stupid and it really doesn't matter. Why don't you focus on something's important? How trivial. So it can actually, I may be still stuck in a mission focus, war mind, battle mind, if you will, and may minimize or not take seriously the very real frustrations of people around me because it doesn't feel terribly important. It may feel trivial. Intimacy issues that can relate to both emotional and physical intimacy, both. And we've talked a little bit about the role changes already. Next slide, please. Okay, transitioning from military life has a lot of challenges, or can have a lot of challenges. First of all, you don't hear people say, I work for the Army, or I worked for the Marines for 4 years. You hear people say, I am a Marine, I am a soldier, I was a Marine, I was a soldier. People assume that professional identity and personalize it to some degree. That is deliberate, I believe, for a lot of military training. They want you to be a soldier. They want you to be Marine, not just work for the agency. You need to be both feet in, wholly sold on what you're doing, because that's the best way to stay focused, stay alive, and stay dedicated to the mission. But if I'm reliant on that uniform, that rank, that command structure, that thank you for your service, that hierarchy, that rifle, that feeling of invincibility, even though I may not be, for me to walk away from all that can be very challenging, because in what or whom now do I find my identity or self-worth? It can be a time when people feel like they've gone adrift. They lost some part of who they are and have to figure out now who they are post-military. If you've done any time in the military, you have to decide where you want to live and who do you want your support system to be. You can't just sort of move into community and expect your neighbors to come introduce themselves. You have to oftentimes be very intentional about forming a community of support around yourself. And that can be very challenging for someone who's spent the past X number of years sort of lilting from one base to the other, one post to the other, and not necessarily have the time or practice in building a community of support. Where am I going to live? Healthcare. The military takes care of healthcare. You get out, well, you got to pay for that a lot, in fact. Employment. Just because I did 4 years in the infantry doesn't mean I'm going to walk into some supervisor position at a civilian firm. I don't necessarily have what they need, and understandably so. I need to somehow rethink my experiences or translate them into civilian terms if possible. And a lot of companies recognize that a lot of the training in the military is great and mission focus is great, but they still don't necessarily have the job skills they need for some specific position in their company. So that may take some starting over. And a lot of people, as you can imagine, after 5, 10, 20 years in the Army or in some branch of the military, aren't necessarily willing to just start over at the base entry-level position because they consider themselves better than that. And they probably are, but they have to prove themselves, hopefully quickly, to their employer. Benefits. What am I going to do about life insurance, health insurance, retirement packages? All of these things, just so everyone knows, you have to serve a considerable length of time in the military to have a retirement pension due to you. Typically, it's 20 years. Sometimes it's much more. By people's choice, but you have to serve length of time. So you don't just serve 4 years and have a pension for the rest of your life. It doesn't work that way. So I got to work, I got to eat, and I got to do something. And how do I access benefits? That's hard to do as well, because while the systems do exist to help veterans, there's a lot of stuff out there to include our agency, Department of Veteran Services. Accessing those benefits can be challenging just because of the administrative burden and the complexity of some of the systems. College, GI Bill. I remember sitting on patrols or sitting in vehicles, guarding some post somewhere in Iraq. I remember turning to people next to me and say, hey man, what are you going to do when you get out? And the number of times I heard them say, well, I guess I'll just go to college, is stunning. That is not someone who has a clear trajectory, a clear study interest, or subject of interest. That's someone who's just going to default to going to school until they figure that out. That is risky. I worry that person is not going to succeed in that academic environment. I have to figure out what I want to do. But the truth is, a lot of folks went into the military because college for that time was not a good fit for them and they knew it. Has that changed 4 years later, 6 years later, 20 years later? College isn't for everybody, and that's fine, but you have to do something. Ultimately, you got to eat. The GI Bill is appealing because it pays for school and it pays you a little bit of stipend, but it doesn't necessarily net you an education if you don't put the time and effort into it, or that's not how you think. Next slide, please. I think we're going to turn it over to Michelle here.
Thank you, Ben. Hello, everyone. My name is Michelle Johnson. I am the East Regional Director with the Virginia Veteran and Family Support Program. Again, we'd like to thank you for attending and watching our MCC training. I am going to go ahead and present on this second portion of our training. Ben did a really great job on explaining kind of what life looks like on active duty. And so we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about what it means to be a veteran and some of the issues that may kind of persist or follow our service members as they transition from active duty to being a veteran and coming back into the civilian world. As Ben, I'm going to go ahead and cut my video now as well so that you all can just kind of focus more on the content. Okay, so let's look at what is a veteran by federal definition. So Title 38 of the Code of Regulations defines a veteran as a person who has served in the active military, naval, or air service, and who was discharged or released under conditions other than dishonorable. So with this, it is important to remember that not everyone identifies as being a veteran. Oftentimes, we see some of our female veterans who do not disclose their veteran status unless you as the service provider ask directly. And in addition to those, we may have some who have not served until retirement or who have not have done 20 years, so they don't consider themselves a veteran. And when it comes to this definition, it really serves as a guide in regards to eligibility for benefits, but does not always guarantee that eligibility. So for example, with the VA Medical Center, some of their basic requirements includes an honorable discharge and 24 continuous months of active duty time. Now with everything, there are always some exceptions based on other criteria, but that is the basic requirement. And then for our National Guard and reservists who may have not been activated to federal service, they may not be eligible for many of these federal benefits as well. Next slide, please. Okay. So looking at our U.S. veteran population, we currently have about 19.2 million veterans in the U.S. Over 9% of those veterans are female. And in 2017, the Gulf War era veterans became the largest veteran cohort population with 7.2 million veterans over the next largest from the Vietnam era, which sits at about 6.6 million veterans. So here again is just a quick snapshot of what our veteran population looks like in the US. Next slide, please. Okay, so what does our veteran population look like here in Virginia? Well, Virginia currently is the 6th largest veteran population in the nation, with over 720,000 veterans residing here. But the population is projected to increase to a rank of 3rd by about 2023. And then we are home to the 2nd largest population of female veterans, which is over about 107,000. Next slide, please. All right, so what are some possible complications that come from military service? So with military service, there can come that possibility of complications, not always, but sometimes there are. And so when there are negative symptoms that are left untreated and can persist for a number of years or lifetime, we have some of these complications. So it could be post-traumatic stress, traumatic brain injury, MST, which is military sexual trauma, moral injury, anxiety, depression, and substance use disorder. I really like this quote on the right side of the slide. I think it does a really great job in kind of summing up what some of our service members are going through once they transition out of active duty. And so it says, I am left with basically nothing, too trapped in a war to be at peace, but too damaged to be at war. And so these are some of the things that we need to really realize that some of our veterans are struggling with as we work with them. Okay, next slide, please. So our brain during a traumatic event. So what happens to our brain during a traumatic event? Well, there are a lot of things that happen because the body, as we all know, is a complex system, which is full of feedback loops. And so when these loops are messed with during a possible event, it could lead to a long-term disabling condition. For example, that condition could be post-traumatic stress. And so a really good example that I always like to use to give you an idea of what the mind goes through when it senses danger or it senses possible danger is that of seeing a tiger in a zoo. So our mind sends this cue to the survival section of our brain. This section gets moving and sends out that fight or flight responses to other parts of our brain. Those parts are able to talk with the survival section and let them know things like, okay, the tiger is in the cage. We know what a cage is. We know that the cage is going to hold the tiger and that the tiger can't escape. So in that moment, we realize, okay, it's okay. We can calm down a bit. Another part of the brain also helps by giving some other context information, like the fact that we're at the zoo, right? We have been to the zoo before. We know that we are safe. We know that the animals are behind the cage, what that looks like, how they function, right? And again, we then begin to calm down. But with different parts of the brain function that keeps other parts and their responses in check, sometimes individuals with post-traumatic stress lose the ability to discriminate between past and present experiences or interpret environmental context correctly. And so that talks a little bit about, again, what our brain is doing and kind of what it looks like during that traumatic event. So again, we want to remember the function of the brain during the traumatic event is purely on survival. We have those fight or flight or freeze responses. Stress activates the immune and defense systems. The brain interprets the traumatic experiences as dangerous, and then the brain generates those powerful memories. Right, next slide, please. All right, so post-traumatic stress. We like to say it's a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. So we know that everyone experiences trauma at some time. And in fact, 1 in 2 will experience a life-threatening traumatic event at some point during their life. It is common for those who have experienced combat to possibly feel irritable, be easily frustrated or annoyed, feel guilt, maybe some of that moral injury. And we'll talk a little bit about moral injury more in depth. They may get disconnected from family or friends, have flashbacks or nightmares, right? These are all normal reactions to an abnormal situation. It's important to note that when these feelings last or persist for longer periods of time and cause problems with functioning, it then can be considered a disorder. Next slide, please. Yeah, again, what is PTSD? Let's talk about it a little bit more in depth. So it is a mental health condition that some persons who have experienced a life-threatening event, such as combat, may develop. It may be that at first it is hard to kind of do those daily activities, such as going to work or school, engaging with family and friends. But most people do start to kind of feel better within a few weeks or months. As I stated before, it is really that part where if it lasts longer than a few months and that person is still experiencing those symptoms, that it could be post-traumatic stress. here is where I do want to note too, is that even though we're talking about what post-traumatic stress could possibly be for an individual, if we are not clinicians, if we are not in that field to diagnose, we do want to be careful about that. We don't want to label someone with having post-traumatic stress or traumatic brain injury or stress and anxiety if we are not in that lane to do so. So again, this just kind of gives you a general idea so that you may be able to kind of encourage the person you're working with or talking with to seek some help. There are some factors like previous traumatic exposure or a person's age or gender that could also affect if the person may develop post-traumatic stress as well. Next slide, please. All right, so military and paramilitary related PTSD. So a lesser discussed element of trauma is really how it can shift someone's worldview. Whereas one might have thought the world to be a generally safe place and that people are generally honest or trustworthy, someone who may have experienced trauma may have determined that opposite to be true. And so whether it's part of post-traumatic stress or not, it may inform their behavior or contribute to some of that distrust. Having the support of one's unit or command or other peer support can also influence how these worldviews are seen and the ability to cope with post-traumatic stress or to even be honest that that individual may be struggling as well. Next slide, please. All right, so treatments for post-traumatic stress. There are treatments for post-traumatic stress that focus on symptom relief and work to reduce distress associated with the memories and suppress the physical reactions. So some of the treatments include prolonged exposure therapy, and this involves processing traumatic memories and thoughts through repetition, which then hopefully reduces their power and impact. We have cognitive processing therapy, and this is a psychotherapy that examines irrational thought. We also have EMDR, which is where you relive the traumatic or triggering experiences in brief doses while a therapist directs your eye movements. And then we have interpersonal therapy, which is used to help with relationship repair, strengthening and rebuilding those relationships. And then, of course, you have your non-traditional therapies, which can be used in conjunction with other therapies or by themselves. And so these non-traditional therapies could be yoga, meditation, mindfulness, equine therapy, or even art therapy as well. Next slide, please. All right, we're going to talk a little bit and shift gears to traumatic brain injury, or TBIs, which you may hear. So a traumatic brain injury, or a TBI, is a disruption in the normal function of the brain that can be caused by a bump, blow, or jolt to the head, or a penetrating head injury. So TBIs can actually range from mild to moderate or to severe. And so those in combat could have been exposed to blasts from IEDs or rocket-propelled grenades or landmines. But even those who are not obviously wounded in an explosion could have also sustained a brain injury. So as you work with service members and veterans, again, just something to keep in mind. It may not have been a penetrating head injury that a service member or veteran may have experienced while in combat or deployed, but they could still possibly have a traumatic brain injury, even from being just exposed. Next slide, please. And again, like I mentioned, not all TBIs may exhibit those physical wounds, and a lot of times they actually will go untreated. So during combat, a service member may continue fighting with little to no time to rest or recover, and then be re-exposed to additional blasts. And then even in times, sometimes a person isn't even aware that they may have experienced a traumatic brain injury. And they may not report, and many will not report the incident. Next slide, please. Okay, so traumatic brain injury and their symptoms. So TBIs, or traumatic brain injuries, can impact any number of things. So a person may be having memory problems or have a decreased ability to problem solve. They may feel irritable or anxious or depressed. They may have bizarre or psychotic ideations. A person may be, again, angry or frustrated and have a loss of sensitivity to others. In addition, a person could experience fatigue and insomnia. And then there may also be an increase in impulsivity. And this could be strong contributors to higher rates of suicide among those with traumatic brain injuries as well. And you know how we just kind of mentioned on the previous side that, or the previous slide, I apologize, that some may not have realized they have even sustained a brain injury. So imagine feeling irritable or anxious or depressed, being angry or frustrated, experiencing fatigue and insomnia, and not having an idea of what is wrong or what is happening. Just kind of thinking about that additional layer of stress that puts on a person, right? You're feeling different. You know that you feel different, but you don't necessarily know what's going on or why you're feeling this way. Next slide, please. All right, here you can see that symptoms of post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury can sometimes overlap and often do. If not known otherwise, it really can be hard to distinguish if someone is experiencing symptoms because they have a brain injury or because they have post-traumatic stress. In addition, a person can have both a traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress. And when you combine having both, a person can have significant difficulty controlling their emotions and behaviors. Next slide, please. Okay, moral injury. So Ben talked a little bit about this on his previous slides, but we'll get a little bit more in depth with what moral injury is. So the key precondition for moral injury is an act of transgression. This then shatters moral and ethical expectations that are rooted in someone's religious or spiritual beliefs, or their cultural-based expectations, or expectations of their organizations, and other group-based rules involving fairness and the value of life and so forth. And so events are considered morally injurious, again, if they violate those deeply held morals and beliefs and expectations. Next slide, please. So moral injury from combat. So we know that our military personnel are well trained in the rules of engagement and do a remarkable job making life or death decisions in war. However, sometimes there are unintentional errors which lead to the loss of a life, maybe of a battle buddy, or those that were around, right? So this can then set the stage for that moral injury. We do have a video clip that really gives a good visual of the internal struggle that a person may be going through if and when they experience this moral injury. So it really kind of is that war inside. So we're going to go ahead and switch over to our video here. All right, thank you. So again, in my opinion, that video does a great job really summing up what moral injury is and what that feels like for our service members and our veterans who experience that. Next slide, please. Right, so military sexual trauma, or MST. So, MST is defined as a sexual assault or repeated unsolicited threatening acts of sexual harassment that occurred while a veteran was serving on active duty or active duty for training. In 2013, the Pentagon reported a 35% increase in sexual assaults. And it is believed that 1 in 5 females and 1 in 12 males is the victim of MST. So again, this is an opportunity here for some of our service members and veterans who may have dealt with MST. If they come to you with that information, a good opportunity to encourage them to seek treatment if you are not a treatment provider yourself. Next slide, please. Okay. So this slide here contains 2018 data pertaining to sexual assaults in the military. As you all can see, there is a lot of information on this slide. So I do encourage you all to go back to review when you have some time. We will make sure, Ben and I, that we have provided a link to the slides so that you can always go back and reference any slides that you would like. But I do want to note a couple of things. In 2006, about 1 out of 14 victims reported the incident of sexual assault. By 2018, 1 out of 3 victims reported the incident. And additionally, 76% of the victims that reported the incident were satisfied with the support that they were able to receive from their victim advocate. Next slide, please. So, what are some common coping mechanisms for military stressors? So, there are a number of coping mechanisms that a person develops to address military stressors. Some may self-medicate, and that could be with drugs or alcohol. Some experience a need to increase their security awareness. To do things maybe such as patrolling their house, putting extra locks on the door, adding cameras, right? They have an increased security awareness and hypervigilance. There may also be some isolation. They may avoid their family or friends, isolate themselves at home or wherever they feel the safest. They may feel like it's just safe to isolate, to stay away. And then a person may also display more self-harm types of actions as well, right? It may be that the person on the expressway is riding their motorcycle at highly excessive speeds. They engage in more of that high-risk behavior. Maybe they have taken up bungee jumping or skydiving, right? Just to kind of feel that adrenaline, to be engaged in kind of that high risk behavior. And of course, these are just some examples, not all of them. And again, some of our service members and veterans may not need to cope. They may already have things in place that kind of help them cope outside of these things as well, but these are just some of the common coping mechanisms that we see. Next slide, please. Okay, so we do have another video, and this video is actually going to contain some graphic images, some gunfire, but does end positively. We want to just kind of give that disclaimer before we pull up the video. This video was created by a returning OEF combat veteran who was having trouble navigating his return to civilian life and navigating the education system. And so this veteran actually created this video as part of his film class for college, but as our other video with moral injury, this really does a great job in showing you, again, what our service members and veterans are dealing with as they come back to the civilian world. So we're going to play that video for you all now. All right. Again, a very powerful video. It really sums up a lot of what we have talked about today. The one really good thing about this video that I really love is that it shows the impact that it has on a person when they realize that they are not in this alone, that there are people who share the same experiences as them, that are there, that have kind of lent out that hand in saying that we are here for you. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to look at suicide and the 2017 Virginia statistics, and then I'm going to provide some up-to-date statistics as well. So the highest number and percent of female veterans since the Virginia Violent Death Reporting System began collecting data. There were 259 violent deaths of veterans in Virginia. 89% were suicide deaths. Veteran descendants were listed with a post-traumatic stress disorder at a rate 3 times higher than others. And then among veterans with a mental health diagnosis, post-traumatic stress was elevated for ages 20 through 24, 25 through 34, and 35 through 44. And so just a couple of, like I said, more updated statistics. We did have more than 6,000 veterans who died by suicide each year from 2008 to 2019. The adjusted suicide rate for veterans was 52% greater than non-veteran U.S. adults. And this is information in 2019. 17 veterans died by suicide every day in 2019. And then of those 17, 10 were not connected to VA healthcare prior to death in 2018 or 2019. So again, just some more updated statistics for you all too, to just kind of put things into comparison. Next slide. All right, so what are some suggestions when working with veterans? Well, you guys have completed the first step, right? Be military cultural competent, but be okay with knowing what you don't know. Veterans will often spot when a person isn't truthful about their experience or knowledge about the military or what it is to be a service member or a veteran. So it is okay to not know what you don't know, and it is okay to be comfortable in that. We want to connect the service member with other veterans. We want to help them develop a peer support network, right? Kind of like what we saw in the video we just watched. It helps to have people around you who understand firsthand what you have been dealing with and what you are going through. Like I had mentioned before, we don't want to make field diagnoses of others. We don't want to label someone with having post-traumatic stress or a traumatic brain injury or anxiety or depression or a substance use disorder if that is not our role. If our role is beyond that, then we just encourage them to seek care. Do not share your personal views on war or politics. You want to make sure that you actively listen to the veteran, right? Consider that the service member or the veteran has a loss of identity or purpose, right? When they were in the military, they were a soldier, they were a Marine, but they may have lost some of that identity and purpose now that they're in the civilian world. You know, that thought of who am I? And then you want to refer to supportive services and other organizations as appropriate. Again, just remember, We're not able to do it all as one person, so it's okay to refer out to those agencies and those organizations that can also assist in helping that veteran or service member. Next slide, please. Okay, so some suggestions when working with combat veterans specifically. So you want to not say you understand what they have experienced unless you have experienced combat or the military yourself. If you haven't experienced those things, then you can't understand what that person has experienced or what they are going through. You may be able to put yourself in their shoes just through being empathetic, but you really kind of want to stay away from saying you understand what they have experienced unless you have truly experienced that yourself. You want to involve the veteran's primary support system. Find out, who do they talk to? Who do they lean on? Do they even have a support system? Long term, you want to recognize the importance in discussing grief and survivor's guilt and the impact of experiences on the veteran's spirituality and their belief system. Again, going back to those feelings of moral injury, that war inside. And then, just like on the previous slide, we want to refer to other professionals as appropriate. Next slide, please. All right, so the strengths resulting from military service. So a lot of this time we have discussed many of the negative impacts that our military service members or military service may have on a person. But it is important to remember that there are strengths that come from their service as well. They learn leadership. They are trained to accept and discharge leadership. They not only encourage it, but motivate others for the betterment of themselves and their mission. They learn teamwork through their military service, knowing that cooperation of the entire team is needed to accomplish the mission, right? That no man left behind. Our service members and our veterans have experience with vast diversity, dealing with individuals from other religions, cultures, races, ethnic groups. Again, putting those to the side and becoming a team. Our service members and our veterans may have traveled and been exposed to many different environments, right? We know that flexibility is a must in the military because sometimes the mission can change at any given time. Not only is it flexibility for our service members and our veterans, but also the family members, right? Because they too have to learn to be flexible and adjust with a short notice. Planning and organization are learned, and being able to work under pressure and meet deadlines, all while having to complete a job right the first time. So we always want to keep those strengths in mind, and we want to build upon those strengths for our service members and our veterans as we come in contact and work with them. And so we have one last video for you all that is going to discuss veteran issues with mental health, as well as their positive attributes. Okay, so here are some really good resources and tools for your toolboxes. One of the resources here on the page you will see is the Department of Veteran Services, the Virginia Veteran and Family Support Program, which is the agency that Ben and I work for. We provide care coordination and resource connection to veterans and their family members. One great thing about our agency is that we do assist all veterans regardless of their discharge, time in service, or era of service that they served as well. We also place a special emphasis on getting those individuals connected to mental health and behavioral health resources as well. So our agency is a great resource along with all of the other resources and tools on this page as well. All right, next slide. All right, everyone, that is the end of our presentation. I want to thank each and every one of you for attending and listening to our presentation here today.